Happy Tuesday, y'all. I'm Abby Martin, and this is Breaking the Set. All right. So I'm starting to think that Wikipedia is funded by the same people who bankroll Fox News. Just to catch you up, yesterday I talked about how Wikipedia had deleted 2 separate pages someone had submitted about me because apparently I wasn't noteworthy enough to deserve text on the site. My whole beef is that sacred wiki admins solely rely on corporate media sources to back up information about a subject's validity, and thus what's considered outside the realm of established media isn't considered notable enough. Even though, according to Alexa, commercial website tracker, RT.com sits at number 392 in popularity, far surpassing the traffic of BBC.com and the LA Times. Look, challenging the sources cited on any given page and even removing pages entirely based on these rules, I can understand. But then today I woke up to the news that the admins on Wikipedia have not just deleted my page, but have moved to actually ban any future attempts for users to recreate it. Seriously, take a look at this revisionism thread on their site. As you can see, the latest move by an admin named John Reeves yesterday made an edit to block all non-admin users to recreate my page indefinitely. Wow, even if this isn't personal, and at the very least, this is obviously a decision based on personal bias. And if you agree that personal bias shouldn't be allowed to deter the flow of information and access to knowledge, then join me and let's break the set.
It was a terrible mistake, and we're working very hard to make up for it.
And once again, to put something on the air, it's a flat-out lie.
Have you ever had sex with Governor Rick Perry?
No, wait, do not answer that.
I want you to watch what we're about to do because you've never seen anything like this on television.
What we need is to question more and to keep it uncensored, real and raw. My simple mission is to change the globe. I'ma do it with this passion and fire untold. These words are hard hitting, you're watching your neck, but you need to tune in because we're breaking the set. Breaking the set. Breaking the set.
Last week, al-Qaeda militants took control of the Iraqi cities of Ramadi and Fallujah after days of non-stop violence. According to independent Iraqi news agency Aswad al-Iraq, 370 people have died in just the last 10 days, although that number is hard to verify considering how bodies are not being taken to the morgue and instead excluded from official death counts. Now, you may remember Fallujah as one of the primary deadly battlegrounds during the height of the U.S. occupation. So what does the fall of the city signify for not only the progress of Iraq, but the region as a whole? Joining me now to discuss is Eugene Perrier, coordinator for the Answer Coalition. Thank you so much for coming on, man.
Oh, thank you so much for having me.
So, Eugene, what are the main factors that have contributed to the near-failed state of Iraq today?
Well, I think the key factor that we have to mention is that the occupation of Iraq by the United States fundamentally destabilized the country. The United States just completely disassembled the Iraqi state as it existed, and not only didn't really put anything in place, but actually set up a structure which made it sort of beneficial for forces to become more adversarial, to divide along sectarian and other sorts of lines. And what we're seeing now is the real fruits of all of these time bombs, landmines that were set by the U.S. occupation, all coming to fruition all at the same time. We saw 2013, one of the most deadliest years. Over 8,000 people died in Iraq. And I think this situation in Fallujah and Ramadi is very related to that.
Horrific. And I think it seems like Fallujah, I know a lot of people, that comes to their head when they hear the word Fallujah because, of course, travesty after travesty during the height of the occupation. We heard that as one of the main pillars of the war. Why are cities like Fallujah and Ramadi so bloody, specifically those cities?
Yes, and I think that's something that really resonates with the Americans. Actually, a former neighbor of mine died in the Battle of Fallujah. But really, Fallujah and Ramadi in particular are in areas of the country that saw some of the heaviest fighting where forces who felt essentially disempowered by the regime, and there had been actually a peaceful protest movement that had been going on for some time in this area of the country that the Iraqi government, the current government, had suppressed. But this area of the country is an area where a number of people It felt disaffected from the political process that was put in place by the U.S. occupation and continued after that. And so, of course, there's been a very significant fight between, well, on the one hand, the government looking to suppress protesters who had been against the current political setup, and on the other hand, between al-Qaeda type militants and the residents of these cities, with these al-Qaeda type forces trying to impose their way of life on these individuals in a very violent manner.
Do you think that the U.S. military actually paying the insurgents to not kill them during the troop withdrawal was the only thing pretty much preventing Fallujah from falling sooner?
No, I don't really think that was necessarily the case. I do think that the real situation that prevented the Fallujah from falling sooner is the fact that people in that area, at least initially, were willing to give a chance to this new governmental setup. With the fall of the U.S. occupation or the withdrawal of the United States, maybe feeling, well, something could change. And then, of course, nothing did change. They set up a protest movement to try to make things change, and then it was violently repressed by the government, and I think that set off a whole range of tensions that didn't necessarily have to end up this way. But really, this current government, which is supported by the United States, part of a process set up by the occupation, really set the stage for this, and it's unfortunate because it didn't have to happen that way.
Well, I guess it begs the question, now that al-Qaeda is officially in Iraq, so does that warrant another U.S. invasion?
Well, certainly there will be those forces who are pushing that, and we've seen that the United States government is now saying, well, we're going to send more guns and more drones and, you know, do what we can to militarize.
It works so well.
I mean, it works so well. I mean, they've got this government that has already found a way using military force to disaffect whole sections of the country in the Kurdish areas in the north, in the so-called Sunni areas in the west, and now they're going to give them more guns and more drones and more military support and think that that's somehow going to decrease war and decrease violence when the opposite has continually been true.
I guess, yeah, that brings me to, you know, this weekend, Iraqi's Prime Minister al-Maliki said that he would no longer support a military assault on Fallujah. Do you agree with that decision?
Well, I think certainly it's the right decision. I mean, I think the United States government is obviously counseling him to do this, trying to recreate something of what they did with the awakening councils towards the end there, where maybe they can buy off some forces. But it doesn't really deal with the fundamental underlying issues that are existing in Iraq right now, which is a political system which disenfranchises the people of Fallujah. So, you know, President Maliki, he can go on and say, Prime Minister rather Maliki can go on and say, well, I'm not going to militarily attack the city, but ultimately that's just a smokescreen to make himself look better when he's already suppressed a movement and set off this whole situation. And it doesn't deal with the underlying situation, which is really the way he's running the country under this occupation set up election system, which disaffects huge numbers of people, and the power he's concentrated in his hands and his inability to find national consensus. Not inability, really unwillingness to find national consensus.
You know, we're talking about Republicans who are calling, and I'm sure other Democrats as well, this is a partisan issue, obviously calling for U.S. involvement in the situation, send guns, send drones, all these things. What role, if any, should the U.S. be playing? Because clearly this is large part fault of this brutal occupation, decade-long occupation. Should there be a humanitarian effort? And if so, I mean, how would that look?
Well, I think it shouldn't be led by the U.S. government. And I think that we've seen around the world they're attempting to use this humanitarian guise, particularly with the Navy and other forces, to really sort of cloak their ability to go into these countries. And we should also say the U.S. stoking the civil war in Syria has helped destabilize the country. I think, obviously, the U.S. people should continue the people-to-people efforts that really begun during the sanctions in Iraq, but also during the anti-war movement to support civil society organizations, trade unions, women's groups, and others who are trying to promote national reconciliation, unity, and peaceful solutions to different types of problems inside of their country, and not rely on the U.S. government, which is blatantly shown that it really only wants to use its power to bolster its own position in the region geostrategically, which is ultimately going to mean militarizing one section of society to suppress another section of society, so that they have this militarized gendarme to rely on in Iraq and other countries to enforce their writ.
You mentioned Syria. How much of this escalation of violence do you think is due to Syria's civil war, and how do you think it will actually affect Syria's war?
Well, I think it's very significant. I think what we've seen is that the civil war in Syria has really emboldened these al-Qaeda type forces. It's given them a cause to rally around, and as we've seen with the unity of forces in Syria and Iraq from these type of political movements, they've been able to coalesce, use the war in Syria to get money, to get guns, to bring in foreign fighters, and it's really stoked the flames of this sort of terrible sectarian infighting that's going on. And this destabilization of Syria, I think it can't be understated how the millions and millions of dollars and the guns and everything that the United States and their friends in Saudi Arabia have been sending into Syria has played a big role in further destabilizing Iraq and helping these armed groups, these al-Qaeda militants, build up their forces, which has emboldened them to launch these sorts of attacks.
Considering how the battle between insurgents and the U.S. military, I mean, it really escalated in Fallujah, like we said. I mean, Fallujah's been really a groundswell over the course of the last decade plus. How do you think soldiers feel who went there, who fought there, to see now just al-Qaeda flags flying in the region?
Well, I think they have to feel that a lot of their sacrifice was in vain. And they would, in fact, be correct at that, because the United States government pumped up all this rhetoric about freedom and crazy stuff about avenging 9/11, even though Iraq had nothing to do with it. They sent, hundreds of thousands of troops there. People fought and they died and they risked their lives. They saw their friends die. And it was only for the United States government to be able to gain further control over the region of Iraq, not for freedom, not for anything else. And so I think it's terrible that people went through such an experience in this city like Fallujah, these sorts of battles, only to see now that what they were told they were fighting for was a false promise, and that the U.S. government comes up and will continue to come up with whatever excuse they can to justify these wars. And it's the soldiers, not the people. Donald Rumsfeld isn't suffering. George Bush is, making $1 million speeches and sitting on his ranch down in Texas. It's the people in Iraq and the people who were sent to fight under false pretenses who are being forced to suffer this terrible violence and terrible remembrance and loss because of the actions of just a few people looking for profit.
Well said, Eugene. What is the current situation of just how unstable it is as of late mean for the future stability of Iraq and just the region?
Well, I mean, I think that it's a terrible thing, and it looks very unstable. Just today, Tuesday, here in Baghdad, I believe 12 people died in attacks. We're seeing that all across the country there's a significant amount of violence, and really the underlying issues aren't being dealt with by the current government in Iraq or their sponsors in the United States or any of the other Western countries. And I think it's an unfortunate situation. We'll just have to see how it plays out, but certainly the carnage unleashed by the U.S. invasion and occupation of Iraq is ongoing and continually destabilizing.
Well, I hope that anyone who supports future military occupations or even interventions at all looks at Iraq as kind of a symbol of why this doesn't work, in fact, makes things much, much worse. Thank you so much, Eugene Prier. Always amazing to hear your insight. Thanks.
Thank you so much for having me.
If you like what you see so far, head to our YouTube channel, youtube.com/breakingthesayit. Be sure to subscribe so you don't miss a single episode. We also have all of our interview segments as well as our other segments tabbed out in playlists there. If you want to catch those separately, I encourage everyone to check out my interview yesterday with RT's Megan Lopez, who was just on the ground at the West Virginia chemical spill to talk about the implications it has for the entire U.S. water supply. So, go to youtube.com/breakingtheset for all that and more. Now stick around to hear about 2 Fullerton police officers who just got away with murder.
I've got a quote for you. Let's make it tea time. Stay away from that story. Let's get this guy elected. Let's smear that guy. Instead of working for the people, politicians and the mainstream media are working for each other. Bribery, staged events, bias, and propaganda. I think I'd rather play alone.
Five seconds. And over the mic is all fueling to go.
Did you know the press is the only industry specifically mentioned in the Constitution?
Stand by.
That's because a free and open press is critical to our democracy.
Track Alpha. Roll Alpha.
In fact, the single biggest threat facing our nation today is the corporate takeover of our government and our press.
Stand by, camera 1.
We've been hijacked by a handful of powerful transnational corporations that will profit by destroying what our founding fathers once built up. I'm Tom Hartman, and on this show, we reveal the big picture of what's actually going on in the world. We go beyond identifying the problem. We try to fix it. Rational debate and a real discussion of the critical issues facing America.
Stand by on camera, go.
Ready to join the movement? Then welcome to the big picture.
You would think that with all the horrible news I cover on a daily basis about the two-tiered injustice system, that nothing would surprise me anymore. But yesterday, the verdict of the case of Kelly Thomas did. Kelly Thomas was a homeless, schizophrenic man living in Fullerton, California, when he was approached by police officers one night, where he was savagely beaten and tased for over 30 minutes. The highly disturbing incident was all caught on camera, where you can hear Kelly calling for his father and pleading for his life. After other officers came to the scene, they tended to the cops instead of the dying man laying in a pool of his own blood. Kelly later died in the hospital due to a lack of oxygen because his chest was so badly compressed from the beating. Now, I warn you, the following image is very graphic, but it's important to see the extent of the attack viciously perpetrated against this young man. There was a huge amount of outrage from the community once the video was released, proving that he posed zero threat to the officers. And the two policemen involved, Manuel Ramos and Jay Cincelli, were put on the trial for his death, one for second-degree murder and the other for involuntary manslaughter. The third officer involved will not face charges. In a stunning verdict yesterday, the jury acquitted both officers of all charges. The attorney for one of the cops, John Barnett, told reporters he was very pleased with the verdicts. He said, quote, "We expected the jury would do their duty, and they did their duty." He added that the officers did what they were trained to do and had no malice in their hearts. If this despicable act is not malicious, then I think it's time to redefine the term, especially considering how in the video you can see Ramos putting on a pair of latex gloves and telling Thomas, "See these fists? They're ready to F you up." Later, he boasts to the other officer, "I just probably smashed his face to hell." More disturbing is that this decision ultimately laid in the hands of those sitting on the jury, who refused to hold the officers accountable for their loathsome actions. So to find out how the community is reacting to the latest news and where the family can go from here to seek justice for their son's death, RT correspondent Ramon Galindo joined us from LA.
Anger and astonishment here in Southern California and around the world after two former police officers were acquitted in the killing of homeless man Kelly Thomas. Now, this case gained international attention after graphic photos and video of the violent confrontation were released online. Manuel Ramos was facing potentially life in prison on a charge of second-degree murder. Jason Cincelli also facing serious prison time for involuntary manslaughter. At the end of the day, it took the jury less than 8 hours to find the two men not guilty on all charges. As the verdicts were being read, the mother of Kelly Thomas, Kathy Thomas, broke down in sobs. Afterwards, when she talked to the media, she said that her son was murdered and that these men had gotten away with it. Kelly Thomas's father, Ron Thomas, echoed her sentiments, saying that he was hurt inside and that this proved that we're not safe in the public. Now, supporters of the Thomas family set up a makeshift memorial at the scene of the death and are protesting today and will be protesting in the coming days. Now, the tape of the brutal beating was shown repeatedly in court, but the defense ended up using it against the prosecutors, saying that it proved that the officers were acting as if they had been trained. Now, the FBI said that it will continue to look at the case, the evidence, and at the testimony to see if there were any civil rights violations. Ron Thomas, a former law enforcement officer himself, says that he will move forward with a civil suit. The district attorney in Orange County, Torrance Caucus, says that he will not retry Cincelli and Ramos, and he will not go after Joe Wolf, who had also been charged in the killing of Kelly Thomas.
That was RT correspondent Ramon Galindo in Los Angeles. According to the Defense Department's own estimates, the U.S. has 900 military bases that sprawl across 153 countries. Many of these bases are the result of strategic international agreements. Others are remnants of past conflicts. But let's face it, with the ebb and flow of U.S. wars for occupation, American bases hardly ever shut down and close for business. In fact, the U.S. still has expansive outposts in Korea, Germany, and Japan. Some countries have 1, some have 3, but specifically on the Japanese island of Okinawa, there are at least 32 U.S. military bases occupying 20% of the island. Now, if you don't think 30-plus military bases on the landmass roughly the size of Long Island is enough, worry not, because plans for yet another base are currently underway. Well, a group of 29 artists, academics, and peace activists have now come together to issue a statement of condemnation against the construction of a new base and a call for an end to the military colonization of Okinawa. One of those people is Peter Koznick. historian and co-author of The Untold History of the United States. He joins me now to talk about the real effect these bases have on the local community. Thank you so much for coming on, Peter. Always a pleasure. So, Peter, you're one of the signers of the statement, along with Oliver Stone, Michael Moore, Noam Chomsky. How did you guys all get together to sign this statement, and what are you trying to get out of it?
Well, we decided to issue this statement after the governor of Okinawa, Governor Nakayama, betrayed his electoral pledge to the people of Okinawa and agreed with Prime Minister Abe that the base could be relocated to the Henoko part of Okinawa. You have to realize that the base already exists in Ginowan City. It's the Futenma base, the U.S. Marine Air Base in Futenma. And there's been a lot of protest about that for many years. In 1996, 3 U.S. troops raped a 12-year-old girl, and the people there were just fed up. So since 1996, there's been a movement on Okinawa to get the base out of Ginowan City, which is this heavily populated area, and the people of Okinawa want to get it out of Okinawa completely. It's been a very unfair situation for a long time. They were first taken over by the Japanese. Then there was the big battle in 1945. Then the U.S., after the war, set up its bases all over Okinawa. And you see this little area, it's really less than 1%, 0.6% of the entire landmass of Japan, and it has 74% of all U.S. bases in this very, very small area. So this was the controversy. Once the governor betrayed the people of Okinawa, many of us decided it was time to act. So we put together this statement, and then we only wanted to solicit a small number of signers originally, people who've got reputations, people who are known by the public in Japan. And so we initially started with 29. We now have about 75. And we'll issue a second statement with more significant people who are known inside Japan.
Incredible. I mean, as we mentioned, Okinawa is about the size of Long Island, roughly. Has over 30 bases, thousands and thousands of troops. Why there? Why is there such a highly concentrated military presence on this island?
Because it's strategically located. It's located close to China. It's located close to Taiwan. It's a base that the United States has already been using in every U.S. involvement in the Pacific. Since World War II, we've sent troops from Okinawa. There was enormous protest there because it was such an important part of U.S. policy in Vietnam. During the U.S. invasion of Vietnam, the troops were going very often from Okinawa. So they've been used in a way that's been very unfair and that they've protested against. There's also a lot of chemical waste there, a lot of toxic elements there, plus noise pollution, accidents of helicopters crashing. People there have really been exploited, and they're strongly opposed to it. In all the polls, between 70 and 90% of the Okinawan population has come out against the base relocation. They want it entirely off of Okinawa. They've got far too many bases already. More than half of U.S. troops in Japan are located at Okinawa. So it's part, as you said before, part of this U.S. empire of bases, as Chalmers Johnson called it. You know, we're very critical of all of that. Our group came together narrowly around the relocation to Henoko in opposition to Governor Nakayama's statement. But many of us have much broader concerns about the U.S. military footprint. And this is also part of Obama's rebalancing toward Asia, his so-called Asia pivot. Hillary Clinton announced this in Foreign Policy magazine in November 2011 in an article titled America's Pacific Century. So this is what we want to shift troops from the Middle East now to the Pacific. We're getting ready for the 21st century, the century when the United States is going to dominate the Pacific even more than it has before. But the U.S. has a big adversary there, and that's China. And whereas a few years ago, the United States was the leading trading partner for all the members of ASEAN, the 10 nations of ASEAN, now China is a leading trade partner with all of them. So it's China's economic growth and China's military revitalization that gets the United States quite alarmed now. So the United States is trying to fortify the area. Right now, our troop balance is 50% in the 50% in the Atlantic and 50% in the Pacific, our naval forces and our air force. We want to rebalance to 60% in the Pacific to 40% in the Atlantic.
You know, reading Blowback from Chalmers Johnson when I was in college actually awakened me to a lot of the effects of U.S. imperialism, U.S. militarism. Really was astounding, that chapter on Okinawa. Yeah. He calls it a U.S. military dictatorship, and he kind of outlines the extreme effects that these bases have had on the local communities. You know, you mentioned this rape case that really got was kind of a turning point for a lot of people there. Talk about the other effects that this presence has had on the community.
Well, sometimes one of the arguments that's made is that it's had a positive effect, that the U.S. economy has bolstered the economy of Okinawa, that we've given a lot of employment. The reality is that in 1972, when Okinawa reverted from American to Japanese nominal control, at that point 15% of the economy and sales were based on the U.S. troop presence. Now it's down to 5%. It's negligible. Only about less than 2% of the Okinawan workforce actually works on the base or related to the base at this point. So it really has a very little, none of the positive effect that they've been trying to say is actually present. The negative effect is pervasive. I mean, this is it's occupation. It's always been occupation. They were forcefully, first Japan fought with them in the 17th century. They were forcefully occupied by Japan and made part of Japan, annexed in the late 19th century. Then the United States took them over, and the United States allowed them to revert. But what you have to understand also is going on there is you've got the Abe administration in power in Japan. And Abe is the most right-wing nationalist, perhaps, that we've ever had in the leadership in Japan. And Japan has been moving sharply to the right, especially in recent months. For Abe's first year, this is not the first time he's been prime minister. He was prime minister from 2006 to 2007. And that time he was forced to resign in disgrace in 2007. He learned his lesson. This time, before he's moved on his real right-wing agenda, what he's done is rebuild the economy. And his popularity actually went up quite a bit from the Abenomics, they call it, revitalization of the Japanese economy. But in the last few months, his true colors are coming out. And his goal is to move Japan so sharply to the right. John Mitchell, the U.S. Attorney General for Nixon, once said in 1970 that this country is going to move so far to the right, you're not going to recognize it. Well, it didn't quite happen under Nixon, it happened under Reagan. But Japan is doing the same thing now. Japan is moving so far to the right that it's going to be unrecognizable. You just look at the recent things, the new defense strategy, increased defense spending for the first time in a decade, including Ospreys, amphibious assault vehicles, drones they want to start purchasing now. But also, in early December, they passed a new secrecy law, and that's going to criminalize all kinds of national secrets and make it much easier to actually make things classified.
Taking a cue from the U.S., Peter, I wanted to interrupt you really quickly because we have about 30 seconds left. Is there any way for people here in America to stop the construction of this base, to stop the relocation of this base?
We're going to have a petition online very shortly. We want people all over this country and other parts of the world to stand behind the people of Okinawa. They've fought alone. They've fought very bravely. There's going to be a mayoral election in the city of Nago, and Mayor Inamine, the current mayor who's really leading the fight against the bases, is overwhelmingly ahead, despite all the efforts of the national government to defeat him. So the people of Okinawa have stood up. It's our responsibility to support them.
We do need to stand with our brothers and sisters there. It's the U.S. that's doing this. Thank you so much, Peter Kuznick, historian, author, Untold History of the United States. Everyone check it out. Always a pleasure. Thanks. That's our show, you guys. Join me again tomorrow when I break the set all over again. Thank you so much. I think it seems like Fallujah. I know a lot of people, that comes to their head when they hear the word Fallujah because, of course, travesty after travesty during the height of the occupation. We heard that as one of the main pillars of the war. Why are cities like Fallujah and Ramadi so bloody, specifically those cities?
Yes, and I think that's something that really resonates with the Americans. Actually, a former neighbor of mine died in the Battle of Fallujah. But really, Fallujah and Ramadi in particular are in areas of the country that saw some of the heaviest fighting, where forces who felt essentially disempowered by the regime. And there had been actually a peaceful protest movement that had been going on for some time in this area of the country that the Iraqi government, the current government, had suppressed. But this area of the country is an area where a number of people had felt disaffected from the political process that was put in place by the U.S. occupation and continued after that. And so, of course, there's been a very significant fight between, well, on the one hand, the government looking to suppress protesters who had been against the current political setup, and on the other hand, between Al-Qaeda-type militants and the rest.
Based on these rules, I can understand. But then today I woke up to the news that the admins on Wikipedia have not just deleted my page, but have moved to actually ban any future attempts for users to recreate it. Seriously, take a look at this revisionism thread on their site. As you can see, the latest move by an admin named John Reeves yesterday made an edit to block all non-admin users to recreate my page indefinitely. Wow. Even if this isn't personal, and at the very least, this is obviously a decision based on personal bias. And if you agree that personal bias shouldn't be allowed to deter the flow of information and access to knowledge, then join me and let's break the set.
It was a terrible mistake, and we're working very hard to make up for it.
And once again, to put something on the air, it's a flat-out lie.
Have you ever had sex with Governor?
Happy Tuesday, y'all. I'm Abby Martin, and this is Breaking the Set. All right. So I'm starting to think that Wikipedia is funded by the same people who bankroll Fox News. Just to catch you up, yesterday I talked about how Wikipedia had deleted 2 separate pages someone had submitted about me because apparently I wasn't noteworthy enough to deserve text on the site. My whole beef is that sacred wiki admins solely rely on corporate media sources to back up information about a subject's validity, and thus what's considered outside the realm of established media isn't considered notable enough. Even though, according to Alexa, commercial website tracker, RT.com sits at number 392 in popularity, far surpassing the traffic of BBC.com and the LA Times. Look, challenging the sources cited on any given page and even removing pages entirely.
Repair it.
No, wait. Do not answer that.
I want you to watch what we're about to do because you've never seen anything like this on television.
What we need is to question more and to keep it uncensored, real and raw. My simple mission is to change the globe. I'ma do it with this passion and fire and tone. These words are hard hitting, you watching your neck, but you need to tune in because we're breaking the set. Breaking the set. Breaking the set.
Last week, al-Qaeda militants took control of the Iraqi cities of Ramadi and Fallujah after days of nonstop violence. According to independent Iraqi news agency Aswad al-Iraq, 370 people have died in just the last 10 days, although that number is hard to verify considering how bodies are not being taken to the morgue and instead excluded from official death counts. Now, you may remember Fallujah as one of the primary deadly battlegrounds during the height of the U.S. occupation. So what does the fall of the city signify for not only the progress of Iraq, but the region as a whole? Joining me now to discuss is Eugene Perrier, coordinator for the Answer Coalition. Thank you so much for coming on, man.
Oh, thank you so much for having me.
So, Eugene, what are the main factors that have contributed to the near-failed state of Iraq today?
Well, I think the key factor that we have to mention is that the occupation of Iraq by the United States fundamentally destabilized the country. The United States just completely disassembled the Iraqi state as it existed, and not only didn't really put anything in place, but actually set up a structure which made it sort of beneficial for forces to become more adversarial, to divide along sectarian and other sorts of lines. And what we're seeing now is the real fruits of all of these time bombs, landmines that were set by the U.S. occupation, all coming to fruition all at the same time. We saw 2013, one of the most deadliest years. Over 8,000 people died in Iraq. And I think this situation in Fallujah and Ramadi is very related to that.
Horrific. And I